Every Friday at exactly 12:30, the elderly man ordered the same bowl of clam chowder, drank 1 cup of black coffee, left a tip larger than his entire bill, and quietly watched the river until it was time to leave. Nobody in the diner thought much about it anymore. Then, during my first week as a waitress, I finally asked the question everyone else had stopped asking. "Sir, why do you always choose this table?" He looked out the window for several long seconds before answering. "Because 42 years ago, that river gave me something I have been trying to thank ever since." If you have ever wondered how gratitude can quietly shape an entire lifetime, I hope you'll stay with me. I had only been working at Harper's Riverside Diner for 6 days when I noticed him. Most regular customers had predictable habits. The retired teachers preferred the corner booth. The construction crews arrived before sunrise. The fishermen always complained if the coffee was even slightly cold. But Walter Brooks never varied by a single detail. Every Friday. 12:30 sharp. Booth number 7 beside the wide front window. 1 bowl of clam chowder, 1 slice of rye bread, 1 cup of black coffee. No dessert, no newspaper, no telephone. He simply watched the slow current moving beyond the docks while eating quietly. When he finished, he folded his napkin into a neat square, placed enough cash on the table to cover the meal several times over, thanked whoever had served him, and walked carefully toward the parking lot with the help of an old wooden cane. "He always tips like that?" I asked Martha Collins, the diner's owner. She nodded without looking up from the register. "For almost 20 years. Does he have family?" "I've never asked." "Friends?" "He knows everyone." She smiled gently. "But he never stays long enough for conversation." That answer only made me more curious, so Walter didn't seem lonely. He seemed faithful. As though every Friday mattered for reasons no one else understood. The following week, I volunteered to take his table again. He greeted me with the same warm smile. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon, sir." "The usual?" "If you don't mind." I laughed softly. "I was beginning to think you might surprise me." His eyes drifted toward the river. I already had my surprise. I wasn't sure what he meant. A few minutes later, I carried his lunch to booth 7. He thanked me, bowed his head briefly before eating, and spent nearly the entire meal looking through the large front window instead of around the restaurant. When I returned with the check, I finally asked, "Sir, why this table?" His hand rested quietly on the edge of the wooden booth. "Because from here," he said softly, "I can still see the bend in the river." "The bend?" He nodded. I promised myself I'd never stop looking. Before I could ask another question, he slid several folded bills beneath the receipt. "Thank you for your kindness today." After he left, I picked up the payment. The tip was almost $100. Beneath the cash lay something that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. An old brass Coast Guard challenge coin. Its surface was worn smooth from years of careful handling. On the back, someone had engraved 5 simple words. "For those still coming home." I hurried toward the front door. Walter's truck had already disappeared beyond the bridge. Standing alone beside booth 7, I turned the coin over one more time. For the first time since taking the job, I realized the generous tip wasn't the real mystery. The river was. I slipped the Coast Guard challenge coin into the office safe before locking up that evening. Something about it felt too personal to leave forgotten beneath a stack of receipts. The engraving stayed with me all weekend. For those still coming home. It didn't sound like a slogan. It sounded like a promise. The following Friday, Walter arrived exactly on time. Same faded blue jacket, same polished cane, same quiet smile. He nodded as I led him toward booth 7. I appreciate you remembering. I suppose routines become important. They do. He looked toward the river before adding quietly, especially the good ones. As I served his usual meal, I noticed something I had missed before. Every few minutes, Walter glanced toward the same bend in the river, never anywhere else. Not at the fishing boats, not at the bridge. Only one narrow stretch where the current curved around a line of old cottonwood trees. When the lunch rush slowed, Martha joined me beside the coffee station. You're still thinking about him. I am. She poured another pot of coffee. I've watched Walter come here for almost 19 years. And you've never asked why? I figured he'd tell me if he wanted me to know. She smiled softly. Some people protect their memories the way others protect family photographs. Later that afternoon, while cleaning booth 7, I noticed something tucked beneath the wooden edge of the windowsill. It was an old paper receipt, yellowed with age. Someone had carefully folded it into a square. Across the back, written in neat handwriting, were 6 simple words. Always leave more than you received. No signature, no date, only those words. I carried it to Martha. She looked at it for a long moment. I remember this. You do? Years ago, Walter accidentally left it behind. You kept it? I couldn't explain why. She laughed quietly. It just seemed important. I turned the receipt over. The printed date was almost 20 years old. The meal cost less than $8. Walter had left a $50 tip. He always tipped that much? Sometimes more. Did anyone ever ask him to stop? Martha smiled. We tried once. What happened? He said the money wasn't payment. She paused. It was practice. Practice for what? He wouldn't say. That answer lingered in my thoughts long after Walter left. Before closing time, I walked outside to the riverbank behind the diner. The afternoon sun reflected softly across the water. From booth 7, I realized, the view aligned perfectly with the sharp bend Walter watched every Friday. An elderly fisherman was securing his boat nearby. Beautiful view, I said. He nodded. Peaceful now. Now? He looked toward the current. 40-some years ago, that bend nearly claimed an entire family during a spring flood. My heart skipped. A family. The Coast Guard pulled them out just before their truck disappeared. He smiled faintly. Folks around here still talk about it. I looked back toward the diner windows. Booth 7. The river. The challenge coin. The receipt. None of it seemed random anymore. Before I could ask another question, the fisherman pointed toward an old photograph hanging inside the harbor office across the road. They've still got the rescue picture. I followed his finger. Through the window, I could just make out the faded black and white image. One Coast Guardsman stood beside a soaked young family on the riverbank. The photograph was too far away to see faces clearly. but the man wore the same calm posture and the same unmistakable smile I had seen every Friday. The mystery wasn't whether Walter had been watching the river. The mystery was why he had never told anyone what happened there after the rescue. The photograph stayed in my mind all weekend. I couldn't clearly make out the faces through the harbor office window, but I no longer doubted that Walter had been standing on that riverbank decades earlier. The real question wasn't whether he had saved that family. It was why he had spent nearly 20 years pretending the rescue never mattered. The following Friday, I arrived at the diner almost an hour early. Martha was already mixing batter behind the counter. "You've caught the mystery, haven't you?" she asked with a knowing smile. "I keep thinking about the photograph." She poured me a cup of coffee. "Just remember something." "What?" "If Walter wanted attention, he could have had it a long time ago." That thought stayed with me. At exactly 12:30, Walter opened the front door. He carried the same cane, wore the same blue jacket, smiled the same gentle smile. Nothing about him suggested he had ever expected anyone to remember what happened on the river. I seated him at booth 7. "The usual?" I asked. "If it's no trouble." "It never is." As I filled his coffee cup, I noticed the Coast Guard challenge coin resting beside his folded napkin. "I almost forgot to return this." His eyes widened with genuine relief. "I wondered where I'd left it." "I'm sorry." "You kept it safe." He slipped the coin into his pocket with extraordinary care. "My wife used to remind me I was always forgetting small things." The words came naturally. Then silence followed. I realized he had spoken about her in the present tense before gently correcting himself. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said quietly. He nodded. "Thank you." No dramatic sadness. Only the calm acceptance carried by someone who had lived with grief long enough for it to become part of ordinary conversation. After the lunch rush ended, I decided not to ask about the rescue. Instead, I asked something simpler. "What made you choose the Coast Guard?" Walter smiled. "The river chose me first." I waited. "When I was 16, my younger brother nearly drowned. He survived?" "He did." Walter looked toward the water. "But I learned something that day." "What?" "Nobody forgets the hand that reaches for them when they believe they're going to disappear." His words settled quietly between us. Just then the front door opened. A middle-aged man wearing a Harbor Department jacket stepped inside carrying a stack of inspection papers. Martha greeted him warmly. "Daniel, your usual?" "Please." I froze. Daniel. The fisherman had mentioned the rescued family. Our outline of clues suddenly shifted in my mind. Walter glanced toward the newcomer only briefly before returning his attention to the river. There was no greeting, no recognition. Nothing. Daniel sat 3 booths away, completely unaware of the elderly man watching the same bend in the river every Friday. When Walter finished lunch, he quietly stood, left another generous tip, and prepared to leave. Before reaching the door, he paused beside Daniel's table. "I hope the river treats you kindly today." Daniel smiled politely. "It usually does." Walter nodded once. "I'm glad." Then he walked out. Daniel watched him leave with the mild curiosity reserved for strangers. "Nice fellow," he said. Martha looked at me but said nothing. After Walter disappeared across the parking lot, I finally asked Daniel, "Do you know him?" He frowned. "I don't think so." That answer made no sense. The rescue photograph. The river. Walter's silence. Daniel's complete lack of recognition. As I cleared booth 7, I noticed something tucked beneath Walter's coffee cup. It wasn't money. It wasn't another receipt. It was an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local Coast Guardsman saves family of 4 during spring flood." The faces in the faded photograph were finally visible. The young Coast Guardsman was unmistakably Walter. Standing beside him was a soaking wet little boy no older than 8. The caption beneath the picture identified him by name. Daniel Pierce. Daniel had been thanking a stranger every Friday with a friendly smile, without ever realizing he was looking into the face of the man who had once carried him out of the river. The newspaper clipping remained in my apron pocket for the rest of the afternoon. I read it 3 times before my shift ended. Each time, one sentence stood out more clearly. Petty Officer Walter Brooks refused public recognition, saying that anyone in his position would have done the same. That sounded exactly like the quiet man who had been sitting in booth 7 every Friday. What didn't make sense was Daniel. How could someone forget the face of the man who had pulled him from a flooded river? The following Friday, I arrived early again. This time I wasn't looking for answers. I was trying to earn Walter's trust. When he entered, I simply smiled. "Good afternoon, Walter." He looked pleasantly surprised. "You remembered my name. I should have learned it sooner." He chuckled. "I've been coming here long enough." The usual lunch arrived without either of us mentioning the rescue. For nearly 20 minutes, we spoke only about ordinary things. The weather, the fishing boats, the flowers blooming along the riverbank. Only after refilling his coffee did I quietly place the folded newspaper clipping beside his bowl. "I found this." Walter looked down. His smile disappeared. He unfolded the clipping carefully, smoothing its worn edges with fingers that had clearly handled it many times before. I wondered where Martha had stored this. "You knew she kept it." I asked her not to throw it away. He looked through the window toward the bend in the river. "You've been asking questions. I hope I wasn't disrespectful." "No." His voice remained gentle. "You've been paying attention." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Walter folded the clipping again. "Most people believe the rescue is why I keep coming back. It isn't?" He slowly shook his head. "The rescue is only how the story began." That single sentence changed everything. He rested both hands around his coffee mug. "A week after the flood, the family came looking for me." "To thank you?" "They tried." He smiled faintly. "I told them they didn't owe me anything." "So they left?" "Oh, they left." His eyes softened with an old memory. "But gratitude has a way of finding another path." Before I could ask what he meant, the front door opened. Daniel walked into the diner carrying a clipboard from the harbor office. He waved toward Martha and took his usual booth. Walter noticed him, but offered only a quiet nod. Daniel returned the gesture politely, still unaware. I leaned closer. "He still doesn't recognize you." Walter answered without bitterness. "He was 8 years old. People change. You never reminded him. I didn't rescue a little boy, so he'd spend his life thanking me." His answer carried no pride, only peace. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed an old photograph, not the rescue picture. This one had clearly been taken months later. It showed Walter standing beside a smiling woman outside a hospital. On the back was written in faded ink, "With love from the Pierce family. Keep believing in tomorrow." I looked up in surprise. "The rescued family gave you this?" Walter nodded. "My wife, Eleanor, became seriously ill that autumn." He paused, taking a slow breath. "We were struggling to afford the weekly trips to a medical center 3 hours away." His fingers rested gently on the photograph. "I never told anyone. You didn't ask for help. I couldn't." He smiled sadly. "I had spent my career helping other people." The river outside flowed quietly past the diner windows. I thought accepting help would feel like failure. And then Walter looked once more toward Daniel, who was laughing with another harbor employee across the room. The Pierce family somehow learned what was happening. His voice almost became a whisper. "They never thanked me for saving them. They simply saved us back." I felt the meaning of every Friday lunch shift change in an instant. The generous tips, the faithful routine, the river view. None of it had been payment for a rescue. It had been Walter's lifelong attempt to repay a kindness that no amount of money could ever equal. Just then, he carefully slipped the photograph back into his wallet. "My doctor called yesterday." His calm expression remained unchanged. "I don't think I'll be making these Friday visits much longer." The words landed more heavily than anything I had discovered about the past. For the first time, the mystery wasn't about what had happened 42 years ago. It was about whether Walter's quiet promise would disappear with him. I couldn't stop thinking about Walter after that Friday. For the first time since I had met him, the river no longer represented a rescue. It represented a debt of gratitude that had quietly shaped an entire lifetime. Monday morning, before my afternoon classes at nursing school, I drove to the harbor office carrying the faded newspaper clipping. Daniel Pierce looked up from a stack of inspection reports. "Back again?" he asked with a friendly smile. "I was hoping you could help me understand something." He invited me into his office. The rescue photograph still hung on the wall behind his desk. This time I stood close enough to study every face. There was young Walter. There were Daniel's parents. There was little Daniel wrapped in a Coast Guard blanket. And standing just outside the frame was an ambulance crew preparing to leave. "You've kept this all these years," I said. "My mother insisted." He smiled. "She said our family received 2 birthdays. The day we were born, and the day we almost weren't." His words carried quiet gratitude. I hesitated before asking the question. "Have you seen Walter Brooks recently?" Daniel frowned. "The Coast Guardsman? You remember his name?" "Of course." He looked surprised. "I've remembered it my whole life." I stared at him. "But you didn't recognize him at the diner." Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. "I recognized him." "What?" "I just knew he never wanted me to say anything." Everything inside me stopped. "He knew that you knew?" Daniel nodded. "The first Friday he walked into the diner almost 20 years ago, I recognized him immediately." "Then why pretend you hadn't?" He smiled sadly. "Because he asked me not to." Daniel opened an old wooden desk drawer. Inside rested a carefully folded letter. My father received this about 6 months after the rescue. He handed it to me. The signature at the bottom belonged to Walter. The final paragraph read, "If we meet again someday, please let me remain simply another customer. If kindness is repaid with attention, it begins to feel like a transaction instead of gratitude." I read the sentence twice. Now Walter's silence finally made sense. Daniel looked toward the river outside his office window. My parents respected his wishes. So did I. But he doesn't know something. What? Daniel carefully removed another envelope from the drawer. This one was addressed to Eleanor Brooks. My parents never told Walter how they paid for Eleanor's medical travel. They wanted him to believe the assistance came from an anonymous veterans charity. I looked at him in disbelief. He still doesn't know? Daniel shook his head. My mother believed accepting direct repayment would embarrass him. So the truth stayed hidden for 42 years. I left the harbor carrying far more than answers. By Friday afternoon, I had made my decision. Walter arrived looking more tired than usual. Even walking from the parking lot seemed to require greater effort. As I served his chowder, I noticed his hands trembling slightly. "You should probably be resting today." He smiled. "I've got one more Friday in me." The words struck harder than he intended. When the lunch crowd faded, I quietly sat across from him for the first time. I visited Daniel. Walter remained silent. He told me about the letter. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. I was afraid of that. He also told me something you never knew. I placed Eleanor's unopened envelope gently on the table. Walter stared at the familiar handwriting. His breathing slowed. "What is this?" "The answer to a question you've been carrying for 42 years. He didn't reach for the envelope. Not yet. Instead, he looked toward the river one more time. "I don't know if I'm ready." I understood. Some truths ask us to relive the hardest chapters of our lives before they finally allow us to heal. Walter kept the envelope beside his untouched coffee for 10 minutes. The diner continued around us. Plates clinked. Someone laughed near the counter. A child dropped a spoon. But booth 7 had become still. Finally, Walter slid one finger beneath the flap. The paper inside had yellowed with age. He unfolded it carefully. Eleanor's name appeared at the top. "My dearest Eleanor." Walter stopped reading. His hands trembled. I reached across the table but didn't touch the letter. He breathed and continued. The Pierce family had written that they could never repay what Walter had done at the river. They also knew he would refuse anything offered directly. So they had arranged transportation, lodging, and meal expenses for Eleanor's medical trips through a Veterans Assistance Fund they quietly supported. Please let us help without making Walter feel indebted. He has already given our family more than we can return. Walter lowered the letter. For 42 years, he had believed an anonymous organization had carried him through the hardest months of his marriage. Now he knew the family from the river had been there all along. "They saved us back," he whispered. His voice broke on that word. I had never seen him cry before. He didn't cover his face or turn away. He simply let the tears come while watching the same bend in the river he had watched every Friday for nearly 20 years. Daniel entered the diner a few minutes later. He stopped when he saw the envelope. Walter stood. Daniel removed his harbor cap. Neither man spoke at first. Then Walter held out the letter. "You knew." Daniel nodded. "My parents asked me to protect their choice. And every Friday, I honored yours." Walter looked toward booth 7. "You let me sit 10 feet away for all those years." Daniel smiled. "You asked us not to turn gratitude into a ceremony." Walter lowered his eyes. "I thought I was protecting your dignity." "You were." Daniel stepped closer. "But you also gave me the chance to protect yours." That was the moment the promise changed. Until then, Walter had treated gratitude like a debt he alone was responsible for repaying. Now he understood it had always moved in both directions. One family rescued from the river, another family carried through illness. No ledger, no balance, only people refusing to let kindness stop with themselves. Martha placed the old rescue photograph on the table. "I think it's time this belongs to all of us," she said. Walter looked uneasy. "No speeches. No speeches," she promised. "No newspaper." Daniel smiled. "No newspaper." I opened the notebook I used for class assignments. "What about a tradition?" Walter glanced at me. I explained the idea carefully. Every Friday, booth 7 would remain available for someone facing a difficult season. A meal would be covered anonymously. A server would receive a generous tip. No questions, no public names. Only one card on the table. Always leave more than you received. Walter listened without interrupting for several seconds. For the first time, he seemed uncertain not because the idea was wrong, but because it might continue without him. "What happens when people ask who started it?" he said. "We tell them the truth," I answered. "Not your name, the reason." Martha nodded. Gratitude should keep moving. Daniel reached into his wallet and placed the first contribution under the sugar jar. I added what I could. Martha opened the register. Then Walter placed his Coast Guard coin in the center of the table. "Not as payment," he said quietly. "As a reminder." Outside, the river moved in the afternoon light. For once, Walter didn't watch it alone. Still, when he reached for his cane, he paused. "My doctor may be right," he said. "This could be my last Friday here." The new tradition had found a beginning. Whether Walter would live to see it continue remained uncertain. 3 weeks later, Friday arrived wrapped in a gentle autumn rain. The river moved more slowly now. Golden leaves drifted across the surface before disappearing beneath the bridge, just as countless Fridays had quietly slipped into memory. Inside Harper's Riverside Diner, booth 7 remained empty. Not because someone had reserved it, because everyone was waiting. Martha adjusted the small handwritten card resting in the center of the table. Friday River Table. Always leave more than you received. Nothing more. No names, no photographs, no explanation. Just a quiet invitation. I checked my watch for what felt like the 20th time. 12:28. No familiar pickup truck entered the parking lot. No slow footsteps, no polished wooden cane. Daniel quietly stepped through the front door, carrying a small paper bag. "He isn't answering his phone," he said softly. Martha lowered her eyes. "I was afraid of that." For a long moment, none of us spoke. Finally, at exactly 12:33, an older sedan pulled into the nearest parking space. Walter climbed out slowly, more slowly than any Friday before. Daniel hurried toward the door. "You should have called." Walter smiled. "I wanted to make it under my own power." Together they walked toward booth 7. The entire diner continued serving customers as usual. Nobody applauded. Nobody stared. Just the ordinary sounds of coffee cups, quiet conversations, and silverware. Exactly the way Walter would have wanted. He settled into his familiar seat beside the window. "This view hasn't changed." "It never will," Martha answered. His usual lunch arrived without anyone asking. Clam chowder, rye bread, black coffee. Walter looked around the table. "So, the tradition has started." I handed him a small ledger. Not a donation book, not a guest register, a simple notebook. Inside were handwritten notes from people whose meals had quietly been covered during the previous 3 Fridays. A widowed schoolteacher, a young father between jobs, an exhausted nursing student, a Coast Guard recruit traveling home on emergency leave. None of them knew who had paid. Each had written only one sentence of gratitude. Walter turned the pages slowly. He smiled after every entry. "This is better than I imagined." Daniel reached into the paper bag and carefully removed the old rescue photograph. It had been professionally restored. The colors remained faded, but every face was finely clear. Walter studied it for a long time. "I haven't seen this version. My mother wanted you to have it." Daniel turned the photograph over. A new inscription had been added beneath the original date. One rescue became countless acts of kindness. Walter gently traced the words with his thumb. "I don't deserve this." Daniel shook his head. "This isn't repayment. It's continuation." Those words seemed to lift something Walter had carried for decades. For the first time since I met him, I saw him lean back without watching the river. Instead, he watched the people inside the diner. A teenage server helping an elderly couple. A little girl holding the door for a veteran using a walker. A young mechanic quietly paying for another customer's pie after overhearing that she had forgotten her purse. Kindness was already moving without being directed. Walter hadn't created heroes. He had simply reminded ordinary people what they were capable of becoming. Before leaving, he reached into his jacket pocket. I expected the Coast Guard challenge coin. Instead, he placed an old brass nameplate on the table. It had once been attached to his Coast Guard locker. Walter Brooks Search and Rescue. He slid it toward me. "I don't need this anymore." I looked up. "It belongs with the Friday River table." I hesitated. "What if people ask whose name it is?" Walter smiled gently. "Tell them he was someone who learned that being rescued and rescuing others are sometimes the very same thing." Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering across the bend in the river. Walter stood carefully, resting one hand on his cane. He looked toward the water one final time, Then he turned away without hesitation. For 42 years, he had believed he needed to keep watching the river. Now he finally understood. The promise was no longer waiting beside the water. It was already alive in the hearts of people gathered around Booth 7. 1 year later, Friday arrived with the same quiet certainty that had carried Walter through nearly 2 decades of faithful visits. The river flowed gently beneath a pale autumn sky. Morning sunlight shimmered across the familiar bend, where everything had begun so many years before. Inside Harper's Riverside Diner, Booth 7 waited beside the window. Nothing about it appeared remarkable. A polished wooden table, 2 coffee cups, a small vase holding fresh wildflowers gathered from the riverbank, and a handwritten card, Friday, River Table. Always leave more than you received. The words had become part of the diner. Customers no longer asked who had written them. Instead, they quietly asked how they could help. I unlocked the front door just before noon. Every Friday had become a little busier than the last. Some visitors came for lunch. Others came because someone had once paid for their meal during a difficult season. Many returned simply to leave enough money so that another stranger would never know who had helped them. Walter had been right. Gratitude moved farther when no one tried to claim it. Just after 12:30, a familiar pickup truck pulled slowly into the parking lot. Walter climbed out carefully, leaning on his cane. His steps were slower than the year before, but his smile was exactly the same. "You saved my seat," he said. "It was never mine to give away." He laughed softly. "No, it belongs to the river now." I poured his usual black coffee. This time he looked around the dining room instead of out the window. A young Coast Guard recruit quietly covered the lunch bill for an elderly widow. A family celebrating a birthday left enough money to pay for 2 anonymous meals. Daniel was helping an older customer carry groceries to her car before returning to finish his own lunch. No one asked for recognition. No one expected thanks. Walter watched the ordinary kindness unfolding around him. "I used to think promises ended when the person who made them was gone," he said. I was wrong. I opened the Friday River Table ledger. It had grown thick with handwritten notes. Some were only a single sentence. "This meal came on the hardest day of my life. When I could work again, I came back to help someone else. I never learned who paid for us, but I hope they know their kindness reached farther than they imagined." Walter slowly turned each page, his eyes filled with quiet tears. "They're not writing about me. They were never supposed to." He nodded. "Good." Before leaving, he reached into his jacket pocket one final time. There was no coin, no letter, no photograph. Instead, he folded $1 bill and slipped it beneath the Friday River Table card. I looked at him, surprised. "You've left much larger tips." He smiled warmly. "Today isn't about the amount. It's about joining everyone else." For the first time in years, Walter walked to the door without pausing to study the river. He no longer needed to keep watch. The promise had crossed the water and settled quietly into countless ordinary lives. As the afternoon sun reflected across the bend in the river, another customer quietly paid for a stranger's lunch before slipping out unnoticed. No one saw who did it. No one needed to. Some stories are remembered because they are told. Others endure because they are lived. Walter's promise had become one of those stories. If this story reminded you that the smallest act of kindness can echo for generations, I hope you'll carry that thought into your own life. Sometimes the greatest legacy is not the life we save in a single moment. It is the kindness we quietly inspire long after we are gone. Thank you for sharing this journey. May we never underestimate the power of gratitude. May we honor those who serve with humble hearts. And may we always leave the world a little better than we found it. One quiet act of kindness at a time.